The old plantation records never mentioned his real name. They simply called him Moses. No family name, no birthplace, no history worth remembering. To the men who owned him, he was just another piece of property, a number written in fading ink beside the value of horses, wagons, and cotton fields. But decades later, whispers traveled across the South about a man who had once lived in chains, killed the master who claimed to own him, disappeared into the darkness, and somehow returned as the owner of the very land where his suffering had begun. Some called him a murderer. Others called him a hero. A few simply called him a legend. Yet every legend begins with a child whose dreams were stolen long before anyone knew his name. And the truth behind Moses' story was far more heartbreaking than the rumors that survived him. The Mississippi Delta of the 1840s was a place where beauty and cruelty walked hand in hand. Endless fields of cotton stretched beneath an unforgiving sun, white blossoms dancing in the wind like snow that never melted. Rivers carved through forests of towering cypress trees, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed like silent ghosts. Travelers often admired the magnificent plantations rising above the landscape, with towering columns and grand porches. But few ever looked beyond those elegant homes. Hidden behind them stood rows of weathered cabins where hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children lived lives measured not in years, but in harvests. Every sunrise meant another day of labor. Every sunset meant another prayer that tomorrow might somehow be different, though hope itself had become dangerous. Among those cabins lived a young boy with unusually observant eyes. The older workers often noticed how he watched everything around him. The movements of overseers, the changing weather, the habits of horses, even the way birds disappeared into the woods before storms arrived. His mother used to smile whenever she caught him studying the world. God gave you eyes that see more than others, she whispered one evening while repairing a torn shirt by candlelight. One day, they'll help you find a road no one else can see. Her words remained with him long after the candle burned out, leaving him wondering what kind of road could exist for someone born into chains. And that question would shape every choice he made. His mother, Sarah, carried invisible scars that no whip had created. She had been sold 3 separate times before Moses was born, watching husbands, children, and sisters disappear forever at auction blocks. She understood something few others dared admit aloud. Slavery did not simply steal freedom. It stole memory itself. Families vanished so often that remembering became painful. Yet every night she quietly taught Moses stories his grandmother had once shared about courage, faith, and people who refused to surrender their dignity even when everything else had been taken away. Never let them convince you that you're what they call you, she would tell him. Names written by masters disappear. The name God gives you stays forever. Young Moses listened carefully, storing every word inside his heart, because stories became the only inheritance slavery could not easily steal, though even those stories would soon face a terrible test. The plantation belonged to Jonathan Whitmore, a wealthy cotton planter whose fortune grew larger each passing season. Visitors praised his polished manners during lavish dinners beneath crystal chandeliers. Ministers accepted generous donations from him, calling him a pillar of Christian virtue. Newspapers occasionally mentioned his success in expanding cotton production throughout the county. Yet those who worked beneath his authority knew another man entirely. Whitmore believed fear accomplished more than kindness ever could. Punishments arrived swiftly for the smallest mistakes. A dropped tool, a slowed pace during unbearable heat. Even speaking without permission could earn brutal lashes before the entire plantation. He believed suffering created obedience, and obedience created profit. His overseer, Samuel Briggs, rarely questioned such methods. Together they ruled through terror so complete that silence became the safest language anyone could speak. Moses witnessed these lessons while still too young to work full days in the field. He watched grown men lower their eyes whenever Whitmore approached. He saw mothers hide tears from frightened children. Most painful of all, he noticed how people slowly stopped believing tomorrow could ever improve. Yet inside the boy, something refused to break. Instead of surrendering to despair, Moses began learning everything he could. An elderly blacksmith secretly taught him how iron behaved under intense heat. A carpenter explained how buildings stood strong despite violent storms. An old stable hand showed him how horses sensed danger before humans recognized it. Every lesson seemed ordinary, but Moses understood knowledge itself could become a kind of freedom no chain could completely imprison. At 13, his strength earned him a place among the field hands. Dawn arrived long before sunlight, pulling workers from restless sleep as horns echoed across the plantation. Days blurred together beneath crushing labor. Hands cracked and bled while harvesting endless rows of cotton. Summer heat shimmered above the fields until the air itself seemed ready to burst into flames. Still, Moses observed. He memorized trails disappearing into distant forests. He learned which creeks remained shallow after heavy rain. He noticed which overseers drank too heavily after sunset. Every detail settled quietly inside his mind, like pieces of an unfinished puzzle whose purpose remained unknown. One autumn afternoon, that purpose came closer than anyone expected. An elderly man named Isaiah collapsed while dragging an overloaded cotton sack. Years of exhausting labor had finally defeated his aging body. Rather than offering water or rest, Briggs accused him of pretending weakness. Without hesitation, the overseer raised his whip. The crack echoed across the fields. Again, again, again. No one dared move. Moses stood frozen, every muscle trembling as Isaiah struggled helplessly against the punishment. Blood stained the dusty ground beneath him while terrified workers stared silently ahead. They had witnessed countless beatings before, yet something about that afternoon felt different. Perhaps it was Isaiah's age. Perhaps it was the simple truth that everyone knew tomorrow the same whip might fall upon them. When the punishment finally ended, Isaiah never rose again. That night the cabins remained unusually quiet. Even children sensed something had changed. Moses sat beside his mother without speaking until she gently placed a weathered hand upon his shoulder. "Anger can keep a man alive," she whispered. He looked toward her. "But hatred will bury him." Moses nodded, though deep inside another emotion had begun growing. Neither of them could yet fully understand. Winter passed. Spring returned. Cotton bloomed once more. Life on the plantation continued as though Isaiah had never existed, but Moses found himself unable to forget. Every injustice added another weight upon his conscience. Every family separated at auction deepened wounds that refused to heal. Every prayer unanswered forced him to question whether justice truly existed or whether men like Whitmore would simply rule forever. Then fate introduced someone who changed everything. Her name was Ruth. She arrived after being sold from a neighboring plantation following the death of her former owner. Unlike many newcomers, Ruth spoke openly despite the risks. She possessed remarkable intelligence and an unshakable belief that no earthly master could truly own another human soul. During brief moments between exhausting work, she challenged Moses in ways no one else ever had. "You watch everything," she observed one evening while gathering firewood. "I've learned watching keeps you alive." "It does," she answered quietly, "but surviving isn't the same as living." Those words haunted him for days. Together they shared dreams too dangerous to speak aloud before others. They imagined freedom beyond the river, small farms where children grew without fear, homes where husbands and wives remained together until old age. Such dreams felt almost impossible, yet speaking them aloud somehow made them seem slightly less distant. Hope, however, often arrives just before tragedy. One humid July evening, Jonathan Whitmore announced plans to sell several enslaved families to settle an expanding business venture. Names were read aloud without emotion. Mothers collapsed in grief. Fathers clenched trembling fists they dared not raise. Children cried without understanding why tomorrow would erase everything they had ever known. Among those listed for sale was Ruth. Moses felt the world stopped turning. For the first time in his life, he realized that remaining silent would not save the people he loved. It would only delay their suffering until another day. As darkness settled over the plantation, he walked alone toward the edge of the forest where moonlight filtered through towering cypress trees. Somewhere beyond those woods lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps freedom itself. Behind him stood the plantation that had stolen nearly everything. Ahead waited a decision from which there could be no return, and before the next sunrise, blood would be spilled that would transform an enslaved man named Moses into a figure whose story would echo across generations. The plantation barely slept that night. A heavy silence settled over the slave cabins like a blanket of smoke. No songs drifted through the darkness. No quiet conversations slipped beneath the cracks of wooden doors. Everyone had heard the names read aloud. Everyone knew that by sunrise, families would begin disappearing forever. Moses sat alone outside his cabin, staring into the dying fire. Every glowing ember reminded him of the choice standing before him. If he stayed, Ruth would be sold. If he fled alone, He might save himself, but condemn everyone else to the same endless suffering. If he fought back, death would almost certainly follow. For years he had believed patience would somehow lead to justice. Now patience felt like surrender. From behind him came the gentle footsteps of his mother. Sarah wrapped an old wool blanket around his shoulders without saying a word. The cool night breeze carried the scent of pine trees and damp earth as she settled beside him. "I've watched that look grow in your eyes," she said quietly. Moses kept staring into the fire. "I don't know another way. There is always another way. Not anymore." Sarah reached into the pocket of her worn dress and pulled out a tiny wooden cross, carefully carved decades earlier by Moses' grandfather, before he had been sold south. "I've carried this all my life." She placed it into his hand. "If tomorrow separates us, remember one thing." He looked toward her. "Never become the same kind of man who hurt you." Those words settled deep inside him. He nodded silently, though neither of them realized how impossible that promise would soon become. Before dawn, the plantation awakened to the sharp blast of the overseer's horn. The humid summer air already clung heavily to the earth. Horses stamped impatiently outside the main house, while wagons prepared for another day's labor. Inside the great plantation house, Jonathan Whitmore enjoyed a leisurely breakfast, discussing cotton prices with two neighboring planters. Outside, the enslaved workers lined up in perfect silence. Every face carried the same expression, fear. Ruth stood among the women, her wrists trembling despite every effort to remain calm. She searched the crowd until her eyes met Moses. Neither spoke. They did not have to. Some promises are made without words. The morning passed beneath a relentless sun. Cotton sacks grew heavier with each passing hour. Overseers barked orders from horseback, while sweat soaked every shirt and dress in the fields. Then, shortly after midday, a young boy stumbled from exhaustion. He could not have been older than 10. His cotton sack slipped from his shoulder, spilling white cotton across the dusty ground. Samuel Briggs rode over immediately. "You worthless little animal!" The boy scrambled desperately to gather the cotton before Briggs climbed from his horse. Everyone froze. The overseer raised his whip. The first strike knocked Tagla flat onto the dirt. A second never came. Without thinking, Moses stepped forward. "Enough." The single word seemed to stop the entire plantation. Even the birds fell silent. Briggs slowly turned toward him. "What did you say?" Moses stood perfectly still. "I said, enough." No enslaved man had spoken to Briggs that way before. The overseer's face twisted with disbelief. Then rage. "You've forgotten what you are." He reached for his pistol. Everything happened in seconds. Briggs lunged forward. Moses grabbed the wooden handle of a nearby cotton wagon. The heavy timber swung through the air. A sickening crack echoed across the field. Briggs collapsed instantly. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The overseer lay motionless beside the cotton rows. For one endless moment, the entire plantation stared in complete silence. Then someone screamed, "Horse!" Workers scattered in every direction. Some ran toward the cabins. Others vanished into nearby woods. The neighboring overseers galloped toward the commotion while terrified children cried across the plantation. Moses looked at the unconscious boy, then toward Ruth, then toward the distant plantation house. He understood immediately. There was no turning back. Jonathan Whitmore emerged onto the front porch holding a rifle. What happened? Nobody answered. Another worker finally shouted through panic. "Briggs is dead!" Whitmore's face turned pale, then hard. "Find him," the order echoed across the plantation. "Hunt every one of them if you have to." Within minutes, mounted patrols disappeared into the forest surrounding the estate. Dogs were released. Riders crossed nearby roads, warning neighboring plantations. A massive manhunt had begun. Moses, Ruth, Sarah, and several others fled into the swamps west of the plantation. The wilderness swallowed them almost immediately. Towering cypress trees blocked the sunlight. Mosquitoes filled the thick summer air. Mud reached their knees with every exhausting step. But Moses knew these woods. Years of quiet observation had prepared him for this very moment. He remembered every narrow creek, every hidden trail, every fallen tree, every place where hunters rarely traveled. As darkness fell, the exhausted group collapsed beneath thick branches overlooking a quiet stream. Nobody dared light a fire. Children cried softly from hunger. Sarah wrapped them in blankets while Ruth searched for wild berries growing among the brush. Hours passed. Finally, one frightened young man whispered, the question everyone feared asking. "What now?" No one answered. Even Moses had no clear plan. Freedom lay hundreds of miles north. Slave catchers filled every road. Rewards would already be spreading through nearby towns. Their chances of survival seemed almost impossible. Then Sarah quietly spoke. "My grandmother used to tell stories." Everyone looked toward her. "Stories about hidden communities. Free people?" She nodded. Deep in these swamps, people exchanged uncertain glances. Most had heard rumors. Places where escaped enslaved families built hidden settlements beyond the reach of slave patrols. Places that sounded more like legends than reality. But legends were all they had left. For nearly a week, they traveled deeper into the wilderness. Food became scarce. Shoes wore apart. Mosquito bites covered every inch of exposed skin. Twice they narrowly escaped armed patrols. Once they watched hunters pass only yards away while everyone hid beneath thick reeds inside freezing swamp water. No child cried. No adult moved. Hours felt like years. Each passing day stripped away another layer of fear. In its place grew something unexpected. Determination. The people no longer walked because they hoped to survive. They walked because returning was no longer possible. On the 8th evening, they reached a small clearing, unlike anything they had expected. Smoke rose gently through towering trees. Small cabins stood hidden among dense vegetation. Children laughed. Women prepared meals over open fires. Men repaired fishing nets beside a quiet creek. Nobody wore chains. Nobody carried a whip. An elderly black man stepped forward, holding an old hunting rifle. His gray beard reached nearly to his chest. He studied the exhausted strangers carefully. "You've come a long way." Moses nodded cautiously. "We're looking for freedom." The old man smiled sadly. "No." He looked around the hidden settlement. You found people still fighting for it. The settlement had existed in secret for years. Families who had escaped plantations, former soldiers, free black craftsmen, runaway children who had grown into adults beyond the reach of slave catchers. Together they had built a hidden community deep within the swamps. For the first time in his life, Moses watched black men make decisions without asking permission. He watched women speak without fear. He watched children run through open fields without hearing an overseer's horn. The sight overwhelmed him. That night, sitting beside a small fire beneath endless stars, Moses finally allowed himself to believe something he had never imagined possible. A different life could exist. But while the hidden settlement celebrated the arrival of new survivors, none of them knew that Jonathan Whitmore had refused to let the matter end. The death of Samuel Briggs had humiliated one of the wealthiest planters in Mississippi. To Whitmore, this was no longer about justice. It was about revenge. He gathered neighboring plantation owners, hired professional slave hunters, and offered an enormous reward for one man, not merely captured alive, because Jonathan Whitmore wanted Moses to suffer before he died. And as the hidden settlement settled into uneasy peace, dozens of armed riders were already following faint tracks leading deeper into the swamp. The legend of Moses had only begun, and the greatest test of his life was still waiting beyond the trees. The summer of 1861 arrived carrying more than unbearable heat. War had begun. Across the South, young white men marched away wearing fresh gray uniforms, convinced the conflict would end within weeks. Plantations lost overseers to the Confederate Army, roads filled with soldiers instead of merchants. Rumors spread faster than newspapers, reaching even the hidden settlements buried deep inside the Mississippi swamps. For Moses and the people living in secret, the war brought both hope and danger. Hope, because the powerful men who had hunted them were now distracted by a nation tearing itself apart. Danger, because desperate plantation owners searched even harder for the labor they were losing. One evening, as thunder rolled across the swamp, the settlement's leader gathered everyone at a large fire. His weathered face looked older than ever. "The world outside is changing," he said quietly. "But wars don't always bring freedom." The people listened in silence. "Sometimes they simply change who carries the chains." Those words lingered long after the meeting ended. Moses walked toward the edge of the swamp, where moonlight reflected across dark water. Ruth joined him. "You've been thinking, I keep wondering, about Whitmore." He nodded. "As long as he's alive, he'll never stop hunting us." Ruth looked toward the distant horizon. "And if he dies, someone else takes his place." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ruth quietly said something Moses had never considered. "You escaped to save lives." She turned toward him. "Don't lose yourself trying to settle old wounds." Her words reminded him of Sarah's promise years earlier. Never become the same kind of man who hurt you. Yet fate rarely asks permission before testing a promise. Weeks later, a frightened teenager stumbled into the hidden settlement. His clothes were torn. His feet bled from days of walking. He collapsed before speaking. When he finally regained enough strength, Everyone gathered around him. "The Whitmore plantation." His voice trembled. "They're selling everyone." The clearing became completely silent. Families, children, old people, anyone still considered valuable. Jonathan Whitmore planned to sell nearly 200 enslaved people before Union forces could threaten his property. To him, they were not human beings. They were assets. Assets that could be turned into money before the future became uncertain. Moses felt his stomach tighten. His own mother had survived because she escaped with him, but hundreds remained behind. Many had helped raise him. Many had protected him as a child. Some had never stopped praying for him after his escape. He stood. "I'm going back." Voices immediately rose around the fire. "That's suicide. They'll kill you. You'll lead hunters here." The elderly settlement leader finally lifted his hand. Silence returned. He looked directly into Moses' eyes. "If you go," Moses nodded, "I know. You may never return. I know." The old man smiled sadly. "Then don't go seeking revenge." He reached into his pocket and handed Moses an old brass key. "What is this?" "The warehouse." Moses frowned. "The plantation stores weapons and records inside." The old man leaned closer. "Free the people." His voice became almost a whisper. "Leave vengeance to history." 3 nights later, Moses crossed the river alone. The plantation looked different than he remembered. The once perfect cotton fields now showed signs of neglect. Many fences had collapsed. The grand house stood surrounded by fewer workers. War had changed everything. But one thing remained exactly the same: fear. Hidden beneath darkness, Moses slipped through familiar trails he had memorized years before. Every tree, every creek, every narrow path, nothing had left his memory. Near midnight, he reached the slave cabins. An elderly woman opened her door after hearing a soft knock. The moment she recognized him, tears filled her eyes. "Moses!" She covered her mouth. "We thought you were dead." He embraced her gently. "There isn't much time." Word spread silently from cabin to cabin. No shouting, no excitement, only quiet determination. By dawn, nearly 60 people had gathered behind the smokehouse, waiting for Moses' signal. Everything depended on perfect timing. Inside the plantation house, Jonathan Whitmore slept peacefully, unaware that history was walking through his own backyard. As the first light touched the horizon, Moses unlocked the warehouse. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside lay rifles, ammunition, horses, food supplies, and stacks of plantation records, documenting decades of human sales. Names, families, prices, children listed beside livestock. Moses slowly picked up one leather-bound ledger. He turned page after page. There was his mother's name, sold. There was Isaiah, deceased. There was Ruth, marked for auction. There was his own name, property. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he carried every ledger into the yard. A single lantern touched dry paper. Flames climbed into the morning sky. The plantation's history burned before everyone's eyes. Smoke poured upward. Shouts erupted across the estate. Whitmore rushed onto his porch, still pulling on his coat. "What is happening?" He saw the burning warehouse. He saw dozens of enslaved people running toward waiting horses. Then he saw Moses. For a moment, neither man moved. Years of hatred stood facing each other. Whitmore slowly raised a revolver. "I should have killed you when you were a boy," Moses answered calmly. "You've been trying ever since." The gun fired. The shot echoed across the plantation. The bullet struck the wooden fence inches from Moses. Before Whitmore could fire again, Union cavalry appeared on the distant road. Blue uniforms, American flags. The war had finally reached the plantation. Confederate guards scattered in panic. Some fled immediately. Others surrendered. Whitmore looked from the approaching soldiers to the escaping enslaved families. His world was collapsing around him. In desperation, he charged toward Moses with the revolver raised once more. This time Moses did not move. A Union officer shouted, "Drop your weapon!" Whitmore ignored him. Another shot rang out. Jonathan Whitmore fell to the ground before reaching Moses. Silence covered the plantation. The man who had ruled through fear for decades lay motionless on the same soil where so many lives had been broken. Moses slowly walked toward him. Whitmore looked up one final time. His lips moved, but no words came. Within moments, he was gone. Moses stood quietly. There was no triumph, no celebration, only a strange emptiness. Years of anger disappeared in a single morning, leaving behind nothing but silence. Ruth approached and gently took his hand. "It's over." He looked across the plantation. "No!" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Now it begins." The Civil War eventually ended. Slavery was abolished. Freedom, however, proved far more complicated than anyone imagined. Many formerly enslaved families had nowhere to go. No money, no homes, no land, only hope. Several years later, the federal government auctioned abandoned plantations whose owners had died or fled during the war. Among them stood the old Whitmore estate. Few wanted it. The buildings had deteriorated. The fields needed rebuilding. The land carried painful memories. But Moses saw something different. He saw a place where suffering could become healing. Pooling savings with dozens of formerly enslaved families, aided by Northern charitable investors and years of determined labor, they legally purchased the property together. The deed bore many names, not just his. The plantation no longer belonged to one master. It belonged to the people who worked the land. The whipping post disappeared. The auction block became firewood. The slave cabins were rebuilt into homes. Children attended a small school built where the cotton warehouse had once stood. Every harvest was shared. Every family received a voice. Travelers passing through the county often asked about the quiet black farmer who seemed respected by everyone. Older residents simply smiled. "That's Moses." Sometimes they added another sentence. "They say he used to be a slave." Others shook their heads. No, they would look across fields now worked by free hands. He became something much greater. Years later, as an old man, with silver hair and weathered hands, Moses stood beneath an ancient oak tree, watching children laugh where chains had once rattled. Sarah's wooden cross still rested in his pocket. He remembered her final words. "Never become the same kind of man who hurt you." He had kept that promise. He had not built another kingdom of fear. He had built a community. When Moses died, the people buried him beneath that same oak overlooking the fields. There was no grand monument, only a simple stone carved with a single sentence. He was born in bondage, lived in freedom, and left the land kinder than he found it. Whether every detail of the legend was remembered exactly as it happened no longer mattered. What endured was the lesson. True victory is not measured by defeating an enemy. It is measured by refusing to become one. And that is why, long after the echoes of war had faded and the cotton fields fell silent, the name Moses was remembered, not as a man who sought revenge, but as one who transformed a place of unimaginable suffering into a place where freedom could finally take root.